Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just here to welcome you all, and then I'm going to ask Professor John Wall, who's the Associate Director of the Center, to say a few words. By the way, I am Shirin Hunter, and I am here with the Center. I suppose I am the resident expert on Iran and Central Asia at the Center. I'm not going to talk too much. The only thing I want, because we have a very full program. We have some really amazing speakers. I think you all have had their bios. All I can say that we have two great ambassadors that are both, expert not only on region, but strategically and others, and of course Ambassador Dobbins, who also had direct experience negotiating with Iranians during the Afghan transition period. I also have a special bonus for you, because I now see that we also have Ambassador Bruce Langan, who is in here, and if anybody knows about intricacies of Iran, unfortunately not a very pleasant fashion it seems, so I'm hoping that he will comment and let us have the benefit of it. So without further ado, I'm very grateful that John Wall has come to represent the Center here. Dr. Esposito would have very much liked to be here, and he sends his greetings to all of you, but he travels a lot. And then again, he's in one of his, I suppose, overseas jobs. John, again, thanks for coming, please.
One of the advantages of the director and associate director of the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding is that we're both Johns. And so you are stuck with the substitute John today with the welcome. As I was thinking about today's session, I realized that if we look at the study of Muslim-Christian relations, particularly as reflected in relations between the United States and various countries in the Middle East, U.S. relations with Iran don't always get good headlines, and often don't get as many headlines as other areas in the Middle East. But in many ways, U.S.-Iranian relations for more than a century have been central to the position of the United States in the Middle East. That if we go back to the consultants more than 100 years ago now, who worked with Qajar leaders and so on down to the present. John Esposito and I like to say, and I saw that Bernard Lewis also joined us in saying that our professional positions were made by the Ayatollah Khomeini. At any rate, U.S.-Iranian relations are crucial to understanding the broader issues of Muslim-Christian relations in our globalizing world. And I look forward to our today's discussion as we look at the present and the future in terms of where we are going and what are the possibilities of possibly, I hope, maybe some positive things as well as our negative things. But you've got a cast that has been marvelously brought together. Shireen very quietly is always reminding us that we should be doing more with Iran, and she has gathered for us really some of the top experts who are available in the field at this point to enlighten us, and I look forward to our session. Welcome to our guests, and welcome to all of you.
Thank you very much, John. And since we have, as I said, a very full program, I'm not going to go on too much in terms of introduction. I would just call Ambassador James Dobbins to give us, so to speak, set the scene. Ambassador Dobbins currently directs RAND's International Security and Defense Policy Center. He has a distinguished career at the State Department, advisors to presidents and so on. As I say, you have the bios, and if not, just Google him. You will see that it's a very, very long list. Jim, thank you for taking part in this conference, and please, we are all ears.
Well, thank you very much, Shireen. Thanks to all for having me. Just issued a report at RAND. I brought a few copies along a couple of days ago, which is a shorter adaptation of a longer piece that we did a couple of months ago, which recommends against threatening the use of force as an element of our effort to halt an Iranian nuclear weapons program. And I thought I might go through the logic of that a bit. There are more copies available online, incidentally, because I wasn't able to bring enough for everybody, unfortunately. Or anybody can just email me after this, and I'll be glad to send copies. I mean, the argument proceeds pretty much as following. First of all, that the threat of force, what is in the diplomatic parlance called coercive diplomacy, seldom yields the desired result. That is, if you threaten somebody to stop doing something or do something, or otherwise you'll compel him to, the reaction is more often to get your adversary's backup than it is to cow him into submission. And I think just looking at the American record in this regard over the last 20 years or so is illustrative of this. Back in 1991, we threatened Saddam that if he didn't get out of Kuwait, we would invade and throw him out. He didn't. We did. We threatened a little later in the decade Milosevic that if he didn't get out of Kosovo, we'd throw him out. He didn't. We did. In 2001, we threatened Mullah Omar that if he didn't expel bin Laden, we would invade the country and overthrow his government. He didn't, and we did. 2 years later, we threatened Saddam that if he didn't persuade us that he had abandoned his WMD programs, we would invade and overthrow his government. He didn't, and we did. So in every one of those occasions, we made very credible threats, which yielded absolutely no results. And the result of coercive diplomacy, thus, was not accommodation, but war. So this is not an argument not to threaten the use of force if you intend to use force. I think it's normally appropriate to give fair warning. Doing so allows you to secure international support, retain domestic support, and provide some chance that you can achieve your objective without the use of force. So I'm not arguing that if you're going to use force, you shouldn't signal that clearly in advance. I'm simply arguing that as a diplomatic tactic to secure accommodation without the use of force, it has a poor record. We then come to the question of whether or not it makes sense to use force as opposed to threaten to use force in order to halt the Iranian nuclear weapons program. I think our argument there proceeds as follows. That whether it was an Israeli strike or an American strike, it would undoubtedly destroy some of their facilities. It would destroy the facilities we know about. It obviously would have no effect at all on any facilities we don't know about. It would set back their program, but it would almost certainly lead them to redouble the effort. It would certainly lead them to conclude that they need a nuclear deterrent. And I think it would lead much of the rest of the world to conclude that that the Iranians had a case in that regard. The result would be, I think, to undermine the international coalition, the very broad and pretty deep international coalition that has been formed in order to dissuade the Iranians from proceeding to build and deploy nuclear weapons. The consequence would be that the Iranians would try even harder, and they would try against less resistance. That is to say, they would have reduced their isolation. The sanctions regime would probably not be as enforced as rigidly in many countries as a result of this. the Iranians would quite probably make the decision, which our own intelligence agencies believe they have not yet made, which is a decision not just to develop the technical and industrial capabilities which are needed to develop a nuclear weapon, which many countries around the world, including NPT adherents, have already achieved, but to actually build, test, and deploy such weapons. So that's basically the argument, to rely on a combination of diplomacy, sanctions, and other forms of pressure to dissuade the Iranians from moving forward. Iran is presumably seeking at least a nuclear weapons capability, that is, the technical and industrial assets needed, for some combination of security, prestige, and influence. And I think they need to be persuaded that if they were to cross that threshold, if they were to test, deploy, build a nuclear weapon, that they would have less security, that they would have less prestige, and they would have less influence. I think the Iranian leadership has the impression that if they just they may have the impression, I don't know, they may have the impression that they just get across the threshold, the game's over, they've won, they're out of isolation, and everything starts back at zero. And I think they need to be persuaded that that's not the case, that they'd remain a pariah, that the sanctions regime would be further tightened, that we would consider an oil embargo, not just some restrictions on their exports, and that there would be other steps of that sort that would further increase the chances of domestic instability and regime change through domestic instability, that they would have less influence with their neighbors and less prestige. And I think it's hard for us to persuade them of that if we keep saying that they're never going to get nuclear weapons because we're going to forcibly stop them. As long as we continue to say not just that it's unacceptable, but that it's not going to happen, we never get around to arguing why they would be in a worse position if it did happen. And I think that we need to begin to persuade them and to build a coalition that helps persuade them that that's the case. Let me, just conclude by saying that I think there is a chance in the coming weeks that there can be a positive step in the negotiating process, which will at least reduce some of the short-term pressures for some kind of military solution. The Iranians are clearly under a great deal of pressure. Their rhetoric has been more moderate in recent weeks. The Obama administration has also signaled some degree of flexibility on its basic objectives. So while I don't think that the problem is going to be solved anytime soon, indeed I don't believe the problem will be solved under the current Iranian regime in any definitive fashion, I believe that there is some chance that the Israeli clock, if you will be stopped, and the prospects of some short-term military action will be averted. What's necessary to do that, as I understand it, is an Iranian agreement to stop enriching uranium up to 20%, to export the more highly enriched uranium that they already have in exchange for fuel that's suitable for their research reactors, and to halt further work at the underground facility at Fordo. If they were to do that, I believe that the current tension and threat of imminent military action would be removed. Over the longer term, I think there's sort of three levels of desiderata with respect to the Iranian nuclear program. One is that they abandon nuclear enrichment entirely. The second, at the other extreme, that's the maximalist position, that they admit all of their previous errors and roll back their nuclear program essentially to zero as regards enrichment. I don't believe that's ever going to happen. under any Iranian regime, including one that was much more to our liking otherwise. All polling and other information suggests that that Iran's mastery of the nuclear fuel cycle has strong support across the Iranian political spectrum, including democratic opposition elements. At the other extreme, the absolute minimum is that they not actually build and test and deploy a bomb. And that, I believe, is quite feasible. Indeed, most American experts believe they haven't yet made that decision and may not make the decision. So that's an achievable objective, even in the short term, and even under the current regime. I believe that a longer-term objective that could be achieved under a different regime would be to bring them into full compliance with the NPT and put them at the same standing as other states with respect to their freedom to develop the nuclear fuel cycle. And I believe that's an objective that's feasible under a new regime. It's probably not feasible under the current regime, among other things because they probably have to admit to violations that they've conducted in the past. So that's how I see the current diplomatic situation and the prospects. I've been a supporter of engagement with the Iranians since I had the opportunity to negotiate with them fairly intensively and relatively successfully back in 2001 and 2002 on Afghanistan. Now, admittedly, that was a different government and very different circumstances. The United States was riding high, Iran was under pressure. We just knocked off one of their principal adversaries, the Taliban. 2 years later, we knocked off another of their principal adversaries, the Saddam Hussein, and they were grateful for what we'd done, and they were fearful that they were next. And this combination of gratitude and fear made them rather compliant. And they were under a government that had been trying to open a dialogue with the United States for several years. None of this is true anymore, and so we don't have those kinds of opportunities. I believe dialogue with any government is worthwhile. I don't believe that dialogue necessarily leads to agreement. I do believe that dialogue necessarily leads to information, and that better information leads to better policy, and that therefore it's worthwhile having a dialogue with your most hostile adversary simply to develop better information and make better policy. And I believe that we and the Iranians have been making bad policy as the result of poor dialogue for several decades now.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Dobbin. The one thing I forgot to say, but which I have to say, is that Ambassador Dobbin is a graduate of the School of Foreign Service. So one cheer for Georgetown. I would next like to, before going to our Iranian contingent or people who can talk to us about Iran, I would like to ask Paul Pillar, please, to come. Paul Pillar has joined Georgetown as a visiting professor and director of studies of the Security Studies program at the School of Foreign Service after many years of distinguished service in the U.S. intelligence community. The reason I suggested that we invite Paul is that I have been reading his stuff lately quite regularly, and I was, to be honest, incredibly impressed both by his foresight but also by his objectivity and the sort of calm way he approaches various issues. He is author of several books and innumerable articles and so on, but also his experience in areas that now are issues in U.S.-Iran relations makes him an invaluable speaker for us. Paul, could you please?
Thank you, Shireen, for that very generous introduction. I'm pleased to follow Ambassador Jim Dobbins, whose work, along with his RAND colleagues on this particular topic, I think is surpassed by no one's. I would highly recommend if at least reading the version that Jim brought today, if not the longer versions of their work on the topic. The discourse on this problem of Iran and nuclear matters here in the United States has, in my judgment, been a very defective discourse as we see it played out in public debate. And one indication of this, I think, is the fact that we've had an Iranian nuclear program going back to the time of the Shah. We've had, in the intervening decades, including the more than 3 decades of the Islamic Republic, succeeding, repeated projections that we were on the verge of seeing an Iranian nuke. And when I say projections, I'm talking about the official estimates as well as the unofficial ones. I was just looking back at some of my stuff that I'd written on this, which included an op-ed in the Washington Post that examined some of the questions that I thought needed to be asked before any thought was given to exercising the military option. That was 5 years ago. People were talking about that. Well, we've obviously had kind of a crescendo over the last year and especially over the last few months of attention to this issue. And I think that's clearly related to the fact that we have a presidential election year. And it's related to everything having to do with the role of Israel in U.S. politics. It's related much more to those things than it is to what's going on the ground, technically speaking, in Iran. I think the single most defective part of the discourse and the debate has been a relative inattention to the issue of exactly what difference an Iranian nuclear weapon, should one be built, would or would not make. That has been treated in a kind of taken for granted conventional wisdom. Of course it would be a very bad thing and we have to avoid it somehow, either militarily or diplomatically kind of way. What passes for analysis has been basically throwing out speculative worst case musings. And there's really no excuse for this because, you know, we had all during the Cold War and the standoff between the US and the Soviets as far as nuclear weapons were concerned, very astute, detailed analysis at places like RAND that gave us a model for looking at what difference an Iranian nuke would or would not make. I've written about this at some length. I'm not going to go over all the details of my own analysis here, but let me summarize it this way. What you do here in the discourse to support the idea that an Iranian nuke would be a very bad thing, I would agree with probably everyone in this room, or at least most people in this room. I think the world would be much better off without an Iranian nuclear weapon for various reasons. But we have to ask ourselves exactly what the difference would likely make, when we compare it with other things we might do, particularly the so-called military option, the things that Jim Dobbins talked about. What passes for analysis takes one of two forms. One, which you hear more from the politicians than from policy analysts, is the idea that the Iranian leadership just doesn't think like we do. They're irrational, they're a bunch of mad mullahs, they're religious fanatics, they don't care about this life, they only care about the afterlife. And the problem with that is it simply doesn't conform with the behavior of the Islamic Republic, which has given every indication of being like many other regimes in which the overwhelming priority for them is to maintain their power and their position in this life, not some afterlife. The more sophisticated sounding kind of analysis, which you hear less from the politicians and more from some policy analysts, is that, well, all right, they're not going to do something crazy like lob a nuke at Tel Aviv the first time they've got one, but just the mere possession of nuclear weapons is going to make a big difference in their behavior in the region in a way that will make them more dangerous, more aggressive, and so on. And all that I can extract from what I hear about that is a vague sense that somehow a nuclear-armed Iran would feel its oats in a way that would make them a little bit more smug in the way they would carry themselves in Middle Eastern affairs. But if you start asking the tough, detailed questions, the kind of things that the analysts asked during the Cold War about U.S.-Soviet nuclear relations, then I have a real hard time coming up with specific scenarios where one could make the case that, yes, this would make a substantial difference in how Iran or its clients would behave. Because what you hear instead are the vague kind of formulations about, well, a nuclear weapon would shield various forms of Iranian behavior. Or Iran could extend a nuclear umbrella to the likes of Lebanese Hezbollah. those are scary sounding words, but if you translate them into what that means specifically, what it means is that Iran would have to threaten credibly to escalate to the level of nuclear war, whatever is the thing in dispute. You know, the latest dust-up between Hezbollah and Israel, or whatever it is. And I have a hard time coming up with plausible scenarios along that line. We hear again and again, you know, the forms of Iranian behavior that we don't like, and they are indeed objectionable forms of behavior with regard to involvement with terrorist groups and the like. But what doesn't get asked is exactly what the difference would be between the Iranian Islamic Republic as we know it today and the Islamic Republic of Iran if they had a nuclear weapon. I'd be happy to go into this more in discussion. I think there is a basis for agreement. There is negotiating space yet to be explored between the P5+1 and Iran. And I would note how little effort and time has so far been spent on exploring that space. Before the Istanbul meeting last month, it was, as far as U.S.-Iranian diplomacy was concerned, as my friend Trita Parsi puts it, a single roll of the dice. He used that as the title of his book, to explain what the Obama administration had done during its first year, which was basically take one crack at a form of engagement, and when that didn't yield an agreement, well, we're just going to fall back on pressure and sanctions. And that's been the basic story for the last couple of years. It's going to take a lot of time and detailed negotiations, not just by the principals who met at Istanbul and will meet again in Baghdad, but at the next couple of levels down, about the details of inspection arrangements and access arrangements and the details of what sort of enrichment program would be permitted and so on. We have barely begun to see the exploration of that negotiating space. Istanbul was basically a get-acquainted meeting. And I would not place a lot of hope on material agreements coming out of Baghdad. In fact, the statement I heard the other day from Lady Ashton, I was kind of taken aback. She seemed to be getting in front of things a little bit and sounding rather optimistic. There are numerous challenges to success in these negotiations, even though, as I say, I think there is negotiating space to be explored. The history of distrust between us and the Iranians, which is well known to everyone in this room, I don't have to replay. Impatience and a failure to recognize what I just said about what an early stage we're at in these negotiations is going to be a problem. You are going to hear many, many voices right here in the United States, not to mention Israel and elsewhere, after Baghdad saying, well, we don't have an agreement, so diplomacy has failed once again. That kind of tone doesn't help, but we're going to hear lots of that. Some people are itching to declare negotiations a failure. There certainly are those people here in the United States. Goodness knows they're in Israel as well, including the government. And I dare say in Iran, among elements perhaps in the Revolutionary Guard, we have similar incentives. And some of these people are in a position to do things to make the prospects of negotiating success less than they otherwise would be. Things like assassinations and sabotage in the other country. Things like something that a hot-headed Rev Guard naval commander might do in the Persian Gulf to create an incident that, despite the wishes of the higher-ups in both Tehran and Washington, might spin out of control. And basically a lot that you're already hearing here in the United States in spinning up for Baghdad that we really can't trust the Iranians even if we did reach an agreement with them. And this is related to the whole question of inflexibility on both sides. On the Iranian side, I think there are, as I say, interests that would not welcome an agreement, interests that are served by having a continued hostile relationship, hostility seen from the United States and Israel and others. I agree with Jim Dobbins that sanctions have had an effect, and a salubrious effect in trying to, or to promote some of that more moderate rhetoric that he referred to. I think there is an interest in most of the top leadership in improving a relationship with the West. And some of the statements that the Supreme Leader made that got some notice, what he said about nuclear weapons supposedly being immoral under Islam. We should not take that as a literal guide to Iranian operational policy. However, the significance of a statement like that is it leaves him and the regime an out to sign on to understandings and agreements with the P5+1 and still be able to hold their head high and say, we didn't lose, we didn't cave, we never had any interest in having nuclear weapons in the first place, which of course is what the regime has been claiming all along. But you add this, this moral proclamation from the man at the top, and that will add weight to the face-saving tactic as well. The bigger problem, I think, as far as incentives on the Iranian side are concerned, is believing that the West, and the United States in particular, really wants a deal and intends to do business with the current regime rather than simply waiting until another regime materializes in Tehran. Think of all the talk that you hear week in and week out about regime change here in this country. Some of the spinning up for Baghdad. I've read some things that basically say that. And look at what we also left with what we did in Libya as, in my judgment, a very unhelpful lesson to regimes in Tehran and Pyongyang, too, by the way. They've drawn some of the lessons very explicitly. We did make a deal with Gaddafi for him to give up his unconventional weapons programs, including nuclear, as well as get out of the terrorism business. And of course, what he hoped to get out of it, what he thought he was getting out of it, was acceptance as a bona fide member of the international community and normal relations with the United States, which he got for a few years, but then the first chance we got to accomplish regime change, we took it and we helped overthrow it. That is not a very helpful message to try to send to the leaders in Tehran. And now most recently I see there was a report in the Wall Street Journal just in the last day or so about the Secretary of State possibly being on the verge of removing the Mujahideen cult from the foreign terrorist organization list. If that happens, it would be a big mistake in its own right and would be a very unhelpful move with regard to these negotiations with Iran. We've had the emphasis on sanctions here in the United States and all the debates in Congress, and one of the things that bothers me about the discourse on that is sanctions have come to be treated almost as if they were an end in itself. We've forgotten what we're trying to achieve here. Or if we haven't forgotten, different people are trying to achieve different things. What I would hope we're trying to achieve is influencing the incentives of the decision makers in Tehran with regard to reaching the kind of agreement we hope to reach through this negotiation process. But we've got the problem, as I mentioned, of persuading the other side that we really are serious about this and we're not just trying to tighten the screws more and more and more in the hope of actually undermining the regime and instead achieving the goal of regime change. Probably the biggest problem that we may face in closing a deal, or even if we close a tentative deal, making it stick, is walking back from sanctions on our side. This is going to be hard. It's hard partly because if you look at the U.S. sanctions, some of them aren't specifically geared to the nuclear question. They're geared to human rights and involvement in terrorism and other stuff. And as far as the politics of it are concerned, especially in a presidential election year, but even looking beyond November, it's going to be very difficult for any administration and any members of Congress to be in favor of a move that looks like being nice to Iran when we're still dealing with the Islamic Republic, we're still dealing with something short of what Jim Dobbins was describing as the long-term goals of getting them totally out of the nuclear business. We won't be achieving that anytime in the foreseeable future. So it's going to be politically very, very difficult for us to deliver in a way that will create the kinds of incentives that will enable the Islamic Republic leaders to sell a deal internally. One last point. Over the longer term, I think we really need to broaden the negotiating agenda. We've been so seized in such an incredibly narrow way on this one nuclear fixation, even though there are plenty of other issues we have to raise with the Iranians and grievances we have with the Islamic Republic, and they certainly have issues and grievances they want to raise with us. And that's in addition to the other respects, like Afghanistan, that Jim Dobbins worked on, where our interests still, to some extent, parallel. And I would add that we even have parallel interest in Iraq as well. If we did have a broader agenda, and I don't predict this is going to happen anytime soon, there is going to continue to be this narrow focus for the time being on the nuclear matter, it would not only enable us to exploit the areas in which our interests may overlap or parallel, it would enable us to chip away at the other grievances and problems we have. And it would make it easier because you've opened the opportunities for trade-offs and everything that results from a bigger negotiating space on even the issue that concerns us most, the nuclear weapons one. So before we get too far into the future, I think we're going to have to talk about a lot of other things. But thank you very much, Shireen, for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was wonderful. And now I think that to start hearing a little bit from the Iranian perspective, I will call on Dr. Amir-Ahmadi, Houshang Amir-Ahmadi, the founder and the president and everything of the AIC. And while he's doing all these things, he also manages to write books, including one that is coming out in the spring. Houshang, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Shireen, and thank you for taking your precious time to organize this event with us. It's a pleasure and honor to be here speaking to this very distinguished group. As I was hearing Ambassador Dobbins and Dr. Pillar, I just remember the AIC white paper that we put together back in 2009. That paper is it's on the AIC website, and believe it or not, 99% of what is being said these days, it's in there. The reason I raise this issue is because I am concerned. I'm concerned that this time too, just like the last time, the administration is not going to listen. I think they should listen to RAND Corporation, to Ambassador Dobbins, to Ambassador Pillar, to Ambassador Hunter, to Ambassador Tom Pickering, and so many great ambassadors this country has ever produced. And they are all saying the same thing. Stop threatening and start talking. I want to today focus on two possible deal breakers. One has to do with Iran's domestic scene, and second, with what I call the possible U.S. miscalculation of what is in Iran's mind these days. Both, I will argue, could be indeed deal breakers. But before that, let me just say also that in 25 plus years that I have been actively in U.S.-Iran relations, I have, just like many of you, have noticed that any time Iran has been ready for a compromise, U.S. has taken it wrongly and withdrawn, and anytime U.S. has been ready for a compromise, and the Iranians have taken that wrongly and moved away. My hope is that this time, that problem of non-correspondence between the wills do not happen. As I speak here, I will say that, as was said, I think Tehran is quite ready. I could say that very openly, quietly, that for the first time ever, perhaps, Iran is more than ever ready. And not only that, Ayatollah Khamenei, who has never, ever put himself directly in any negotiation with 5+1 or the US, is right in it. I will explain to you in a second that he is right in it, and it's impossible for him to go home failed, because otherwise, I would say, tremendous consequences will follow from that defeat. But first, I just have a statement that I wanted to read from, and that would be probably more time-saving. I think on the Iran side, as I said, there is a serious struggle domestically between two groups. Bottom line comes to Ahmadinejad versus Khamenei, but they are really not directly in the scene. They are in the scene through their representative over how to negotiate with the US as they go to Baghdad or in Istanbul when they were. Iran newspaper, the official newspaper of the government, wrote an article a few days ago accusing openly by name Foreign Minister Salehi and Mr. Alaaddin Burujerdi, who is the chair of the Parliament's Committee for Security, National Security and Foreign Policy, basically telling them, you have created a situation where Iran's negotiating power has been reduced, tremendously weakened, because these guys, along with a few others that have been implicitly accused, including Haddad Adel, who is very close to the leader, and Jalili himself, who is the negotiator, that they have been going around begging the United States, that is to say 5+1, to remove sanctions. In fact, Jalili has been quoted saying, asking Ashton, quoting 100 times during the meeting, that please remove sanctions. Now, the opposition in Tehran to this particular view argues that that will give the US a wrong impression. It will misread us wrongly, because the government has been arguing over the last several years that sanctions will have no impact, that you will not be able to bring us to our knees by just adding to more and more sanctions. And now you guys, that is the officials, are going around and saying, well, sanctions are having an impact, please remove it. Okay, otherwise we may come to our knees at some point. So that argument is understood and understandable. I believe Khamenei is in charge of this process. I don't think that the group that is opposing Khamenei is going to have to succeed. But the problem is already there. Bastab, a site that is very close to Hashemi Rafsanjani, and he is this, president of the Expediency Council, and Mohsen Rezai, who is the secretary to that particular organization, which is also, in a way, indirectly in charge these days of this negotiation. Bastab wrote a piece in return and in response to Iran, basically directly accusing Ahmadinejad by name, saying that you guys have done this in the past. Now that our country is prepared to reduce tension and come to an understanding, you are going around and destroying that opportunity. You better stop doing it. And in fact, he gives, the site gives examples. And one example it gives that I had never heard, and that's very interesting, is a new revelation. It says, when Larijani was the negotiator and also the secretary of the National Security Council, obviously made a deal with Mr. Solana, with Mr. Solana in Brussels. In Brussels. And that particular deal had 11 quote-unquote articles. And that particular deal had been okayed by the leader. But immediately after the deal, Ahmadinejad made a speech at the Friday prayer and said, this deal has been done behind my back. It will not go, and he dismissed Larijani. And Khamenei, obviously, because he was not, open in the field with this particular deal, said, all right, if you don't want Mr. President, let it go. Now, according to Bastab, if that deal had gone through, we will not be here now in terms of sanctions and everything else. And therefore, basically saying, Mr. Ahmadinejad, you are responsible for all the sanctions, okay, that are imposed on us, and now you blame us for asking to remove them. This is where the debate in Tehran is. Again, there are other people that are taking from this debate and writing many articles, but the bottom line is that this problem exists. Now, I believe this time, as opposed to the Brussels agreement, Khamenei is more in charge than he has ever been. Ahmadinejad has been weakened tremendously, and I don't believe he could derail this particular movement that has been started between Iran and 5+1. Again, Ahmadinejad could make all kinds of other moves that could create problems, like he went to Abu Musa, an island, that is under dispute, and of course it's an Iranian island, according to Iran, but it created a lot of problem out there. I don't believe, however, that that would be the case now. Ahmadinejad will not be in a position to disrupt that. What my concern, therefore, is that that deal breaker from domestic politics is weak, is under control, and Khamenei could deliver. What concerns me is the deal breaker in the US side. Now, here is what I think the deal breaker in the US side is. Again, there are so many other evidences that I can see. I don't believe, at least I have to be convinced, that the move from the US, the discussions that are around and very hopeful, very positive, optimistic, this particular change of mind in this country is strategic. I believe it is tactical. Now, if it is tactical, as opposed to being strategic, we are in serious trouble, and I will tell you why we are in serious trouble. Now, why it is tactical as opposed to strategic? Because when I read from so many things that is coming, particularly the piece that Los Angeles Times, for example, reported, and it got like so much hype around. The fact is that the New York Times, the LA Times piece doesn't say that the United States of America has accepted Iran to enrich at 5%, at its soil. What it says is that we think that the course of diplomacy has not yet worked, that we need to move in stages, and at some point in the future to make Iran stop enriching. So therefore, what the US is trying to do is to basically start a negotiation with Iran, to take some from Iran, give some to Iran, but at some future point to come back and say, sorry, you still are enriching, and as per the UN resolutions, you have to stop it. Now, if this was to be the case, again, I suspect that is the case. I hope not. It is not the case. If that is the case, we are in trouble. And why we are in trouble? We are in trouble because Khamenei, as I said, is in the middle of this. Khamenei has said over and over that the nuclear enrichment on the Iran's soil is part of Iran's national dignity. It is Iran's sovereignty, its pride, its prestige, and everything else that he could find to connect to this particular enrichment issue. Now, he has been saying it over and over. Now, I don't believe this man can really drink that poison cup that Khomeini had. Why? Because after all, Khomeini took that cup with him, and that cup doesn't exist anymore in Tehran. And second, this is not the same man, and Iran is not in the same situation. I believe if Khamenei was to agree to any idea about suspending enrichment on Iran's soil now or in the future, he is finished. He is finished, and the Islamic Republic is finished. That's how the people in the right are saying. The conservatives are saying daily. If I had time to go into the detail of this quote that I have, you would have seen what it is. And the speech is available. Please read it. Actually, it's now being published at the Asia Times. It's right on the Asia Times website now. Now, so therefore, if Khamenei was to not succeed in gaining certain concessions from the US, for example, on the sanction side, he would be going back home from Baghdad seen, quote-unquote, defeated. But he cannot afford to be defeated for two reasons. First, inside in the country, people like Ahmadinejad and others are going to have to make a mess. And Khamenei can't just afford to be reduced to Ahmadinejad's level. Second, his theory that US is after regime change will be much more stronger than it has ever been. And therefore, to save himself, Khamenei will have absolutely no option but to become even more radical. And I believe the way he will become radical is after any defeat, if God forbid it happens, he will give a notice to IAEA. They need to give the notice 3 months in advance that we are withdrawing unless A and B are met. And if A and B, which is sanctions or whatever that is, are not met, then we will withdraw, and they will withdraw if those sanctions, those permissions, those conditions are not met. Now, you may say, Khamenei understands the consequence of it. I say yes, but it doesn't matter whether you die in the war front or in your bed. Okay, if you don't take that action, you are dead. Khamenei cannot afford to be defeated this time. He is right in it. In fact, Jalili is speaking not for Iran. He is speaking for the person of Ayatollah Khamenei. In the letter he has that he showed to 5+1, the letter says openly that this man represents not just Iran, but the person of Khamenei. So this is very important, the development that what I'm trying to do is to say is that this is a very different situation. And my hope is that the United States will not miscalculate this time, that it will be realistic about what it can get from Iran at this stage, and that it will not be tactical, but strategic about this move, and that we will end up into something that is happier than what I was predicting. My hope is that I'm wrong. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ushai. You just touched on something that has troubled me for so many years, and if I can be permitted a little bit of self-advertisement, if you read my book, Iran's Foreign Policy in the Post-Soviet Era, the problem intra-regime rivalry has been that, unfortunately, Larijani is willing to bring, in order to bring down Ahmadinejad, is also willing to sabotage nuclear agreements. And because when Ahmadinejad wanted to make concessions in Geneva, Larijani prevented that. The whole problem of Larijani brothers is thing. But I think that one of the problems for the US, however, has also been that we haven't done anything really, unfortunately, wise to strengthen those elements that actually can do reform in Iran. I mean, our treatment of Khatami regime and things that we did with him is a case in point. I mean, isolation is not going to improve human rights conditions. So I don't want the chairman shouldn't do any of this kind of pontificating, but I just couldn't resist it. And I agree with you, because when I think that actually when I believe Paul Rouhani, that they agreed even before that in Paris Agreement, Larijani said that you gave pearls and got a box of chocolate instead. So I think that they have been playing such games, frankly, with Iran's destiny that makes the corrupt Qajar politicians look like positively skillful and nationalists and patriots. Well, anyway, enough of that little outburst. I would like now to ask Houman Maj to come. Houman is actually is an author. Many of you may have already seen him in various television programs on the very. But he has also written two important books on Iran, Iranian domestic politics. More importantly, he is actually is the only one that actually spent any considerable amount of time in Iran, and I think I could say that he's also reasonably well plugged, at least with some sense. So thank you very much, Houman, for coming, and we're eager to hear you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Shireen. I'm not sure what else I can add after all those great presentations. I think we all, it's kind of like preaching to the converted here. Everyone's basically saying the same thing. Sanctions don't work, threats of war don't work, and so on and so forth. I'm not an academic and I'm not a historian. I'm a journalist and writer, so I basically observe. And Shireen is correct in saying that I do have continued to travel to Iran despite some difficulties here and there since the post-election crisis in Iran. I think what I want to talk about really is more about the American misunderstanding or underestimation of Iran. There's a reason why when they asked me, what do you want to title your brief talk, I said, misunderestimating Iran, which is, bumbling in the language as well as in real life. And I do believe that it really started more with President Bush than in previous administrations, only because of the nuclear issue being much, much more in the forefront of the discussions on Iranian-U.S. relations because of what was revealed supposedly by the Mujahideen in 2001 about the Iranian nuclear program. And then it becoming much more important. I think it's important to think about all the things that we were talking about here, which is the infighting inside the regime, which Hushang pointed out and Shireen correctly pointed out, has been going on forever, actually. It was going on in the Shah's time, was going on in the Qajar time, and it continues. And that's part of the Persian political system, and I don't think that's ever going to change. No matter who is in charge, whether it happened under Khomeini, who had a much firmer grip on Iranian politics than even Khamenei, although Khamenei's grip is much firmer now than it probably has been ever in his 20 years as supreme leader. So I think that's not unusual. I think what is important to think about when we read about things in the media about how Iran's political infighting is affecting the nuclear issue, how Iran's political infighting is making it an unstable country, politically unstable, is to remember where the history of what these nuclear negotiations are all about. If we believe some of these media reports, if we believe what the Los Angeles Times says, what the New York Times has repeated, the Washington Post, both in editorials and in op-eds and in articles written by various journalists, that the U.S. at this point is prepared to allow some form of enrichment on Iranian soil. And the U.S. wants Iran to stop enriching at 20% uranium, 20%, and it wants basically for the Fordo facility to be closed. Well, let's think back to what Iran's position was before President Obama took power. It didn't have Fordo. It wasn't enriching at 20%. And it had far, far fewer centrifuges. So as far as Iran is concerned, they've done pretty well. They've put facts on the ground that are now almost impossible to roll back. If we're talking about giving up 20% enrichment for Iran, it's not a big deal as far as Iran's concerned. Despite all the hullabaloo, despite all the political infighting, despite the Green Movement, despite the human rights abuses, the nuclear program has gone forward. They've managed to create facts on the ground where the 3.5% enrichment now, today, looks damn good to us. If they were to limit to 3.5%, that would look really good to us. We'd say, hey, wait, we've won. When in fact, that was the position that Iran had until 2009. Fordo, which is a facility which was built specifically to withstand a military attack, which only has 3,000 centrifuges in it at this point, and probably doesn't have room for a lot more, and therefore is unlikely to be the kind of facility that could create bomb after bomb after bomb. Again, I'm not a nuclear expert, but could be a manufacturing place for nuclear weapons. That is something that is very specifically designed by the Iranians to counter the threat by Israel and by the United States to militarily take out their nuclear system. So I think if that threat is removed, verifiably removed, in other words, if there's some kind of non-aggression pact that the United States could sign, I don't think the Iranian regime would have a problem with maybe not mothballing Fordo completely, because once they've built it, they're not going to destroy it themselves, but at least temporarily putting a halt to any activities there, or some kind of agreement that there wasn't going to be an attack in the next X number of years while these negotiations go on. So Iran's poker has actually been really good. Their bluffing has been very good. And I think we have to recognize that we could have had a deal in the Bush administration where Iran would have been enriching uranium on its own soil with what was called back then a pilot program. I was present when former President Khatami came to the United States in 2006, a year after Ahmadinejad took office. And although he came here not as a representative of the government of Iran, there was no question in anybody's mind that he was in contact with the authorities back home, particularly with the office of the Supreme Leader, if not the Supreme Leader himself, during his trip here. There was a dinner at Ambassador Zarif's house here, who was the UN ambassador at the time, for the Council on Foreign Relations. Richard Haas was there, a bunch of people were there, basically from the Council on Foreign Relations, where former President Khatami laid out what Iran would be willing to do, which was, it was willing to, at that point, a year into Ahmadinejad's administration, and this was, what they call second track diplomacy, I suppose, was willing to limit enrichment at Natanz to 164 centrifuges, 164. And Khatami knew that evening that that message would get back to the White House that night, if not that night, certainly by the next day. And there was no response to that. So back in 2006, again, 6 years ago, we could have potentially had a deal where Iran had no more than 164 centrifuges spinning. Today they have 10,000 or 9,000, 8,900. The number goes up and down depending on who you ask and when you ask it. But I think the real issue here is that Iran is consistently being underestimated by the United States. I'm not suggesting that the Iranians don't underestimate the US or don't underestimate the resolve of the US. They do, and they have done in the past, and they continue to do so today. They have underestimated the resolve of the Obama administration when it came to pressure, when it came to sanctions. They completely underestimated that, and I think they have been taken by surprise in terms of the severity of the sanctions, but not just the sanctions on the part of the United States, but the compliance with the sanctions, unilateral American sanctions, by many of their so-called friends, including even today, India cutting back on its oil threat. So I think Iran has been surprised by that. They were surprised by the decision taken by SWIFT, for example, agreeing to an American request that they stop handling Iranian bank transfers, which is impactful, which is hugely actually impactful on the Iranian economy, and I think people recognize that. As Hussein pointed out, Ali Akbar Jamanfek, who is President Ahmadinejad's advisor and who is the editor of the newspaper that he was referring to, that slammed the negotiating team for asking for sanctions to be removed, I think they're all very well aware. President Ahmadinejad himself, his boss, has said the sanctions are affecting Iran. They're very well aware that sanctions are affecting them. I mean, the government. And the Supreme Leader is not so isolated that he has no idea what's going on in society. He has a lot of different advisors. He has a lot of advisors who give him different advice. He still listens to some of the reformists, as well as the conservatives and the hardline fundamentalists. But I think what we have to consider in America is there are, as various people have pointed out today already, there are people who would love to see these talks sabotaged. I include the Wall Street Journal and Rupert Murdoch in that group. I include even, and I'm going to make some enemies, but I include people like David Albright in that group, who, for some strange reason, decided that this week he's going to publicize the fact that Ali Akbar Salehi, the U.S.-trained foreign minister of Iran, was in charge of acquiring technology, nuclear technology, back in 1991. Like 1991 and 2012 are in any way related. Whether he did or didn't is completely irrelevant, I think, to what the talks are today. The timing of putting out this report to me is very suspicious. And I'm not just some Iranian conspiracy theorist. I am Iranian, but I'm also American. I grew up here all my life, so I do take conspiracy theories that Iranians love with a grain of salt. But in this case, I'm kind of a little surprised by these little things that are popping up a few days before Baghdad on the part of Americans who I believe have different agendas. We also have in America, and I'm not including present company, but we have a lot of people who've made a career out of analyzing Iran. And you know, if the nuclear deal is signed, sealed, and delivered tomorrow, I think a lot of them might be out of work. I think that I've tried to not rely on being an expert, so I find that to be to my advantage, and I'll still continue to be able to write and hopefully do my journalism, maybe non-Iran related if there's a deal, but I do think that there are a lot of people who have specific agendas, whether it's an agenda to overthrow the regime in Iran on the part of Iranians and Iranian-Americans here, who may have access to people in power or people in former positions of power who do have access to people in power, such as Paul bringing up the MEK. And I think all these agendas are here conspiring to do something that I think no American or no Iranian really wants, which is to lead us down to a path of either war or this continued hostility, which exists to deflect attention away from a number of things, including something that we don't want to really talk about very much in the United States, the elephant in the room, the Israeli issue. And the Israeli issue as it relates to the Palestinian issue, and as it relates to the peace process, which, as we have seen in the last 3.5 years of Obama's administration has been completely sidetracked and sidelined because of, mainly when it comes to foreign policy, because of both the Arab Spring, to be fair, not just Iran, but also the threat to the security of the world is Iran. The threat to the security of the world is not Palestine. It is not the PLO. It is not Islamic Jihad even. It's Iran. And if that narrative continues, I think it's to the advantage of certain people, including the Likud party, who doesn't appear to want to make peace and is in power in Israel right now. And this is not something that I say, and my Israeli friends who are journalists say the same thing. So I think there's a lot of factors here that we have to consider. And I'm probably relatively pessimistic that there is a deal that can be made, no matter what Iran agrees to, between now and November, that President Obama would be able to agree to. And I think there is no deal that the US would agree to, that Iran is able to agree to between now and November, if you take into consideration the red lines that Israel has and the fact that President Obama is in a re-election campaign. By the way, the Iranians are very well aware of this. I was in Iran most of last year. When you talk to any Iranian official, they're very smart about all this stuff. It's not like they're completely ignorant. They underestimate America. They underestimated Obama, I think, many times. But they're not, they do understand the limitations in America. When it comes to sanctions and lifting of sanctions, I mean, last year, I was talking to one official and talking about sanctions. They said, we understand that Obama can't just lift sanctions. It's Congress and this and it's that. We understand that. I think when the Iranians talk about relief from sanctions, they're talking about relief from sanctions that are about to take effect in July. And I think there are certain sanctions that the US president can lift or can waive, at least. And they're looking for those gestures. I think the Iranian government is looking for certain, or at least the supreme leader, who is, as Hussein said, in charge and actually has always been really in charge. He's allowed some of the other people to continue the fight for him, but he is ultimately now in charge, and he's made it very clear that he's in charge. He has to be able to say to the Iranian people that they got something in return. I mean, if Iran Air was able to buy a brand new 747 because President Obama waived the sanction on selling a passenger plane to Iran, that would be a huge deal. It's not that huge of a deal to us, I don't think, in America, but that would actually be a huge symbolic gesture for the Iranian people. And I think it would go a long way to alleviating some of the concerns that Iran has in terms of trust. And that's a very, very simple thing. The Friday prayer leader, Yazd, who has since passed away, said that to me when Obama first took office. He said, when Obama first took office and I happened to be in Iran doing a cover story for Newsweek, actually, at the time, I said, well, isn't it good that, President Bush is gone, Obama's here, and he says all these nice things? He said, yeah, he says all these nice things, but let him do one thing. I said, like what? He's like, sell us one plane, And I think that would reflect the feeling at, Friday prayer leaders in Iran get their instructions from the Supreme Leader's office. They report to the Supreme Leader's office. And so I think that reflected a sense from Iran that they wanted something beyond words from Obama. And, I don't think they feel like they got that. So there is cause for optimism, but I'm pessimistic now really only because of the election. I think I'm not enough of an expert on Israeli politics, or I have no idea how Netanyahu is judging all of what's going on here, whether he feels, and I've had this discussion with Israeli journalists, whether he feels that Obama is going to win and therefore it's better for him to attack Iran now than after Obama is in his second term, or whether he thinks there's a chance that Mitt Romney could win, in which case, if Mitt Romney wins, then, he's already said he's going to outsource our diplomacy to Israel anyway. He'll be, basically Netanyahu will be Secretary of State. So it won't be a problem. I don't know what he's thinking. I have no idea. I don't know very many people who do know what he's thinking. Even people who are close to Netanyahu apparently say they're not sure. Jeff Goldberg at The Atlantic says he's not sure what Netanyahu is thinking. If Jeffrey Goldberg doesn't know, I sure as hell don't know. But the pessimism, I think, has to be there because when you have statements by the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, saying that this is kind of the last chance, the Baghdad talks, and when you've got statements by various other people, including the Israelis, saying that it's now or never, Iran has to come with something, giving something. I think you're, again, putting the narrative back in the way it was, this idea of threats, if you don't do this, then this will happen. And I don't think Iran can afford to, as Hushang said, can afford to negotiate meaningfully under these kinds of threats. The legitimacy of the Islamic Republic is based on a number of things. Everybody thinks that the legitimacy of the Supreme Leader is only religious. It's not. The Islamic Republic, as the Supreme Leader, is a part of and he's not supreme for nothing. He is the most important part of this Islamic Republic. But the legitimacy of the Republic is founded on religion, yes, because the Iranian people are religious, and they do, in general, I mean generalizing, of course, they have, certainly since 1979, were a religious conservative society that did believe in their priests and the word of their priests. The legitimacy is founded upon its sense of justice, which is being eroded today. When you have the sense of justice, which they've talked about for 30 years, it's been eroded. It's been eroded by the Green Movement. It's been eroded by people getting beaten up on the streets. It's been eroded by political prisoners. And they're aware of this, by the way. The clerics are very well aware of this. This is why there's some internal fighting even within the clerical hierarchy on this particular issue. It's been eroded by the huge gap between the rich and the poor in Tehran. When I was living in Tehran, in my neighborhood, there was a 24-year-old guy who drives a Bugatti Veyron. Bugatti Veyron, I don't think there's one in Washington. I don't think there's one in New York even. There might be one or two in California. It's the most expensive car in the world. It's $1 million US in America. In Iran, he can't register it because they won't register the car. In Iran, the DMV won't register. Say, what the hell is this? To have it serviced, he has to fly it to Dubai. In Iran, it cost him $2 million. If he were to be allowed to register it, it would cost him $4 million. He's 24 years old. So the gap between the rich and the poor in Iran, something that you didn't see even until 5 or 6 years ago, has grown immeasurably. The economy has affected the poor far more than it's affected the wealthy. So that legitimacy is people are starting to see that. I mean, when you're in a taxi cab in Tehran, and an Audi R8, sorry for putting all these names out there, an Audi R8 that costs $120,000 in the US, that I didn't even know what it looked like because I live in New York, so we don't see cars that much. And the taxi driver says, hey, look at that R8. What do you think that kid did to make that much money? I said, well, how do you know about an R8? Oh, we know. We know these kids they get this money from. We don't know where from. So you've got that legitimacy of social justice being slowly eroded. So there's one last thing that the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic is founded on, and that is independence and not being subservient to any greater power, something that Iran has been for the last at least 200 to 300 years, in the minds of the revolutionaries, including the revolutionaries who today disagree with the Islamic regime, such as the reformists, such as the Green Movement people, even people who would want to overthrow this regime, even the Mujahideen Khal, who are sworn enemies, even they used to say, at least, until they wanted favors from Israel, they used to say that they wanted independence from the greater powers. What Hushang alluded to is absolutely true. I mean, it's not just Khamenei personally, but the entire regime in Iran has constantly put this nuclear issue on par with the oil nationalization issue of 1953, which we know about because of the CIA-sponsored coup. We know about because of Prime Minister Mossadegh, for those of us who followed Iranian history, but which is a very, very important thing for the Iranian psyche. 55 years later, 60 years later, it's still very important. And even though this particular Islamic regime has not been very kind to the memory of Mossadegh himself, because he was basically secular, I think, more than anything else. But I think that using his name, using the oil nationalization, there were even articles in Iran when the nuclear issue first came up, and when Iran was taken to the Security Council. If you read the Iranian media, they compared what Britain had said in 1953 about oil nationalization to what the US was now saying, calling oil nationalization in 1953 a threat to the national security of the world, because Iran wanted its own rights. So I think a repetition of that is absolutely impossible for the Iranian government. I think that's something that Hillary Clinton, President Obama, all her and his advisors should be, one would hope, well aware of, that it is impossible for the US to make any deal with Iran that would endanger that legitimacy. If you start losing a little bit of your theological legitimacy, if you start losing a little bit of your social justice legitimacy, and then you lose the last thing that you had, which is actually the one thing that pretty much all Iranians could agree on. Because the religious stuff the secular guys didn't care about, the secular women didn't care about, they're fighting it actually. They don't want to wear the hijab, the women who are secular. The guys don't want to, they want to be able to have a drink in a bar in Iran, you know? So those things, they're not going to agree on. On the social justice, many of the rich upper middle class Iranians never agreed with that. They think Iran should be as capitalist as it can be. They're like, you know, Mitt Romney. They don't like the poor. So the only thing that all of them can agree on is that national interest thing, that national independence. And that's the one thing they can agree on. This is the one thing that this nuclear policy has been for the Iranian government. I think if we're not aware of that, then I think that we're going to continually underestimate the Iranians. The one thing they can rally around, the one thing they can be confident on. What we shouldn't be confident about at all is regime change, the idea of regime change. And Ambassador Dobbins brought it up a couple of times that that's potentially something that we could, you know, we could do business with a different regime. I just don't see at this point the way we are going, I mean, the way the relations between the US, or at least the West, and Iran are, that regime change is in the cards anytime soon. And I think you agree. I don't think that that's a disagreement. But I think this concept of regime change and the constant bringing up of regime change, especially in our media, is very harmful to the potential for some kind of détente between Iran and the US. I think that the Iranian people, if you ask them, inside Iran, whether they're pro-regime or anti-regime, they tend to all, pretty much, not all, but most agree that if this pressure on the Iranian regime was removed, if this pressure of this concept of regime change, this concept of threats, the assassinations, the this, that, and the pressure on the nuclear program was removed, there would be much more room for civil society to grow. And there's much more room for, if not regime change, at least regime alteration, at least a sort of reform, democratization of Iran that far more people in Iran want than don't want. And I would even include some of the very conservative politicians, like Mohsen Rezai, who was brought up, who used to be a Revolutionary Guardsman, who competed against Ahmadinejad in the 2005 election, who do want to see some a better form of Islamic democracy than exists today. But they all recognize when you talk to them that under the circumstances today, where they feel that they're under threat, they feel that the CIA, they feel that the American and Israeli intelligence services and the British intelligence services are there to undermine the Islamic Republic, are there to bring it down by any means, that as long as that's going on, nobody dares say anything. And then they feel that they can't really organize in any way to bring about the kind of changes that they believe that the Iranian people want, whether it's within this system or it's going to be a future system. So I think that, you know, again, the hope that we're going to have a different regime to deal with in 2 years or 5 years, I think is unrealistic. I think the idea that Iran is weak at this point is unrealistic. I think the administration should, again, not underestimate Iran's ability to do the things that it says it's going to do. We didn't think it could enrich uranium to 20%. It did it. We didn't think they could build fuel rods. They've done it. They built fuel rods now we don't know if they work yet. So hopefully when they put the fuel rods in, the reactor won't explode. But we know that they built them. So we shouldn't underestimate Iran, and in continuing this dialogue, I hope that, you know, we can get between now, the end of May, and November 4th, we can get to a point where at least we will have prevented war, or prevented the warmongers from taking us to that step. But I don't see any real movement beyond that.
I know I shouldn't be doing that, but you know, I can't control myself. One of the things that I would like to add, and that will also give me kind of a transition to what Ambassador Hunter is going to ask, which is a wrap-up, but also to try to put the Iranian situation, the Iranian issue in the broader context of United States strategic interests, broadly speaking, in the world, including in the Persian Gulf. We have been very quickly, in fact, fact, in the past several years, have become from demonizing the Islamic regime to demonizing Iran writ large. And not just Iran after the 1979, but Iran going all the way back to 3,000 years ago. And that some of the things that we are doing in the Persian Gulf and so forth, that frankly, I find it like Arabian Gulf and whatever, I find it misguided from the United States perspective. The other thing is that, we talked about the Israeli influence. I think that the extent to which our perceptions of Iran have been generally shaped by Iran's historical rivals, particularly Saudi Arabia. And what Saudi Arabia is doing vis-a-vis Bahrain, that is a powder keg, and yet we are ignoring it completely, or the whole idea of creating Saudi. I mean, Kuwait see that the Saudis' idea of unity of the GCC means Saudi domination. And if you look at the history of House of Saud that started from Najd and took all of Arabia, and you look at the, you mentioned the issue of Abu Musa. I was at the foreign ministry during that time. U.S. was quite aware of what Iran was going to do. I was there when my boss called the ambassadors, Arab ambassadors, and told them what's going to happen. Sir William Luce negotiated that. And this Abu Musa is another legacy of Britain, imperial unfinished business from Palestine, Kashmir, Cyprus, and so on. But the point is that to try to say that we have to think about Iran differently, unfortunately, often is as is interpreted, and certainly those who say are being accused of being apologists for the regime, they are not. People who have been victims of the Islamic Revolution are saying that. But we have to be very careful not to conflate Iran and the Islamic regime, and we are very quickly going on that. One of the things that is becoming, one of the reasons that now I would say that people in Iran, at least those who are not, have any sense of patriotism, not the Mujahideen Khalq, and believe me, if they go to power, they're going to become even more patriotic than you think. They just want power at the moment, is that they feel that basically what is between Iran and the oblivion is Khamenei. Because some of the things that people are talking, or their interpretation of democracy in Iran is, for example, actually leads inevitably to the territorial disintegration of Iran, something that we never say about Turkey, and at least not openly in the case of Iran, definitely not about Pakistan, and so on and so forth. So having said that, and this will give the transition to Ambassador Hunter to actually sort of make sense of all the things that we have discussed, how it relates to United States' other interests, and whether this obsession with Iran is not letting us maybe to ignore some other things that we shouldn't. Ambassador Hunter, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hunter. Wow, this has been quite a meeting. I think we've heard a lot of very intelligent things said here. The question is whether we can translate it into something, and I was asked to talk about changing the dynamics. I'm not so sure I can do that, but let me give a little bit of a try. First, this is a very important subject, very important meeting that we're having here today, and a very critical time, not just because we're talking about issues of war and peace. After the United States has been involved in the region in one war for now more than 10 years, which we're looking to find a way of disengaging, beginning with the turnover of the active combat role to the people of Afghanistan in 2014, with, I fear, following that, a result similar to what we saw in Vietnam, because I think we'll lose interest in it. In part because Afghanistan is not really in the Central American strategic interest. There are a lot of things in the neighborhood which are, and I think Iran is one of them. Secondly, we've been in Iraq since 2003 in one of the worst strategic miscalculations in all of American history, second perhaps only to abstention from the League of Nations, and we still haven't gotten over the impact, particularly in the Western Alliance, and in perceptions of American capacity to think clearly about our own interests, leaving aside the damage done to the American economy, which is going to have a long time to play out. It's also a critical time because of opportunity costs. Let me just mention two. Number one, in the disengagement from Afghanistan and its potential evolution in a way that it does not become, again, directly or indirectly, a challenge directly to our security, has happened at least in some respect leading up to 9/11. If we're going to see a future in Afghanistan that is not going to see just a return in that direction, we need to involve all the regional powers. I was at a meeting at a fairly senior place 2 days ago in which that point was made. We need all the regional powers involved, and I said, does that include Iran? Oh, absolutely, it does include Iran. I said, well, we're willing to talk with them about Afghanistan. Well, we try, and we meet with them occasionally in international conferences, but nothing formal and nothing really out loud. And oh, by the way, the fact that they denounced the security agreement between us and President Karzai certainly didn't help matters. No sense that there might have been some Iranian perspective in that, but here's an opportunity cost in my judgment, and nobody in the room is better prepared to testify to that than to Ambassador Dobbins, who has spoken very eloquently on various occasions about the role Iran played in 2001 in helping us to overthrow the Taliban. And then we all know what happened when a junior White House speechwriter invented a thing called the axis of evil. The president put on the list, and the possibility of cooperating with Iran and Afghanistan disappeared. And I would argue that we paid a heck of a price for that. Another example of opportunity cost we're going to see this weekend in Chicago, where the NATO summit will take place on Sunday and Monday. And one of the major issues relates to what's called the interim operational capability of missile defense. Well, as many people will tell you, this particular part of the missile defense system is directed against Iran. There's no secret about that. Not an Iranian capability today, but an Iranian capability that might come into being sometime in the future, a marrying of a nuclear weapon, which Iran certainly doesn't have, and a ballistic missile, which it also doesn't have, though it might conceivably have the latter sooner than the former. Though putting the two together is a task that very few countries have managed so far to do. But what is the opportunity cost? All right, fine, you can say missile defense costs you a little money, a little bit of tension with the Allies, but the Russians will not be going to Chicago. In fact, a major reason for moving the G8 conference from Chicago to Camp David, in addition to the fear that there will be demonstrations against the G8, the so-called Occupy movement, which anybody had asked me, I could have told them, having myself been in Chicago in 1968, writing speeches for Hubert Humphrey when we had the riots. They're worried because there will be demonstrations even just with the NATO summit, but by God, they would have had a lot of demonstrations with the G8 there, and the most important thing for an administration, this administration, in Chicago is to have it as boring as possible and not to have any demonstrations. The other reason is that it was clear the Russians weren't going to come, and you couldn't have a meeting of the NATO-Russia Council. And you wouldn't want to have a G8 meeting with Putin there. It turns out he's not coming for a reason that may or not be credible about, I got to put my administration together. But the idea of Putin getting out of that meeting and going home wouldn't have been good politics. So you moved the G8 to Camp David. Well, the Russians are playing games up to a point with missile defense, but essentially missile defense we are doing because of concerns about Iran in the future, and not so much our concerns, but the concerns of a country that are close to us. It's an example of domestic politics at work. Let me tell you a little bit about my own history in this. I go back a little ways on Iranian issues, though even as was said earlier, if the issue gets settled, what will happen to the people in the Iranian business. I've also been involved in Arab-Israeli issues since 1967, so my future is secure. So I won't worry about that particular thing. And in fact, I was in charge of Middle East affairs in the National Security Council from 1979 to 1981. Fortunately, I had a deputy, Gary Sick, who had the primary responsibility for the Iranian account, but I was involved. And let me tell you a remarkable thing that happened. In the middle of the hostage crisis, where the United States was under assault, as we felt, and none more than our good friend Bruce Langan is sitting here. Incidentally, if Bruce is prepared to see a different route for dealing with Iran than a lot of people in the U.S. government, if you invoke the concept of blood money, he has the right to pass judgment on it more than any other than about 52 of America's, of compatriots who were prisoners of the Iranians for 444 days. But right in the middle of that, I helped develop a thing called the Carter Doctrine. And let me demystify what the Carter Doctrine said. It said, in effect, not in these words, but in effect, if the Soviet Union follows up on its attack on Afghanistan and attacks Iran, we will go to war to defend Iran. That's what it meant. Now, admittedly, it was under particular circumstances where we didn't want the Soviet Union to miscalculate. But can you imagine that here's a country that is holding our people hostage, and yet we're prepared, the President of the United States, to stand up in front of the Congress and say, I will defend that country. I don't know, maybe there's a precedent for that. If so, I don't know it. Now, I've been asked to say something about how we change the dynamics. I have to say the following. There's nothing we can decide in this room that's going to do that. There's nothing we can decide in this room about the tactics of the talks that are coming up. We just can't do it. One thing we are very good about in the United States government is we do tactics very well. So do lots of other countries. We don't do strategy very well. And in fact, since the early days of the Cold War, we haven't had to, or we didn't think we had to. And in fact, since the end of the Cold War, we haven't, in my judgment, done strategy very well in the world in general, except for one extraordinary matter that was put forward by the first of the George Bushes, grand strategy for post-Soviet space and Europe, to create a Europe whole and free and at peace. One of the few times we've come up with a real grand strategy, ab initio, and he did it, and we're still trying to implement it. What has to happen has to be done within the United States government. But it will help to have a debate. We are also sometimes good at debates and sometimes not. We did not have a debate in this country, in the public prints, in the media, in the Congress, before we invaded Iraq. It was suppressed. There are a number of people who were put on the blacklist by various media people who are still there. We don't forgive people who were right. We have never forgiven a lot of people who were right on Vietnam. I wasn't. I was wrong in Vietnam. I was in favor of the Vietnam War for a long time. I was in the White House as a very junior person on August the 4th, 1964, at the time of the Tonkin Gulf. And we, as a nation, got ourselves involved in Vietnam, and it took a long time to figure out that maybe it wasn't the right thing to do. The same thing with Iraq. We had a wonderful debate on the Iraq War afterwards, when it became legitimate to do so, but not when it might have helped. We're in a similar situation with regard to Iran today. We're not having the great national debate we need to have. You don't see very much. We've already heard some of the media outlets that will not allow certain things to be said. The paper that talks about all the news that fits to print puts on its front page analyses of IAEA deliberations, which are plain fabrications. And people who are involved in those negotiations will say that, but okay. It got to the point, in fact, in which the ombudsman of the New York Times had to take it up himself. He didn't clarify the issue, but at least he printed Mr. Beeman's comments on that particular thing. The issue has to take place within the government because we're in what I call bubble time, treadmill time. We get started down a path, like on Vietnam, like on Iraq, like we are in Iran, and it's very hard to get off it. Now, that makes us an implacable enemy, which can be a great thing. World War II, great thing. Saddam Hussein miscalculated in 1990 when he got our dander up. And I'm sure whoever it was that told him that the American charge spoke for the United States when she said this was, I give you an amber light, that guy was probably taken out and shot afterwards, but it was too late for Saddam on that particular occasion. But the question is, how do we break the cycle before it's too late? Well, we're not going to do that. That's going to have to happen in the United States government. Now, what do I recommend? What do we need to do? Number one, the President and the Secretary of State need to hire some people who know what they're doing in regard to strategic thinking, in regard to this particular issue. There are a lot of very talented people in the United States government on this issue. Hunter's Rule, having now worked in the White House 5 years, including in charge of 2 of the most important portfolios, Europe and the Middle East under Jimmy Carter, is that whatever you want to know, if you want to call Paul Pillar, for example, about something, everything you need to know on the outside, well, there's somebody who knows it, but you have to do 2 things. First, you have to find Paul Pillar, then you have to listen to him. First is easier than the second. And you have to break through that particular thing, and that requires courage and leadership on the part of a president. And you have to be willing to do it sometimes against incredible odds. No accident that the power of the China lobby was finally broken. The only precedent I can think for what we've been going through in recent years was finally broken when one of the most anti-communist people we had, who ran on red baiting for years, a man named Richard Nixon, understood the strategic importance of an opening to China, which helped us lose a war without paying a heavy political or strategic price. It was a brilliant maneuver, but who else could have done it except Richard Nixon? We need something of the level of courage like that. We don't have a Richard Nixon in the presidency right now because we don't have anybody who's taking that kind of position. Not that I'm arguing in favor of that. We need a qualitative analysis about Iran. We need a qualitative analysis about the region, and it needs to start with the following. What is our basic interest in the region? As a whole, not just 8 different parts in the area between Morocco and the Hindu Kush or beyond, but it's all one in some respects, as we've seen with regard to what they call the Arab Spring and what's happening within individual countries. And it was we've seen with certain kinds of interactions where whatever connection the Arab-Israeli conflict has to what's happening with Iran, happening with terrorism, etc., we can debate that all day. But to say there's no connection is nonsense. So of course there's a connection. The question is how one deals with it. We do not have a process in the U.S. government, and we rarely do, which looks at these strategic elements all together. That's point 1. Point 2, and this goes against conventional wisdom. I think we need to deflate the nuclear issue with Iran. We've already heard arguments earlier today that maybe Iran with the nuclear weapon is something we can deal with, we can live with, maybe. In fact, I would argue up until about a year ago, reading the tea leaves of the U.S. government. I won't even pretend to read the tea leaves in Iran. I won't even pretend to do that. But I can try to read tea leaves here in the United States. The conventional wisdom was moving in the direction of a containment policy, if need be. If the Iranians would go so far as to get the bomb. If they would. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. I don't know. Though I will say this, if I wanted to design a policy to drive Iran to get the bomb, I would do exactly what we've been doing in the last 10 years. It's amazing that they haven't gone that far. Well, time to change, but I'm not so sure we're going to be able to do so. Whether it becomes something of a terrible import or not, I don't know. I think the Iranians would be crazy, as has already been said, to get the bomb. Even though the lesson of what Gaddafi did, who came to the same conclusion, it's not a great lesson if you're trying to convince Iranians to go in that direction. They'll become more of a pariah. What's one weapon going to do? And if they were to use it, that's the end of Iran. Will other countries in the Middle East get the bomb? Of course not. They'll just cozy up under us even more. And even if they wanted to get the bomb, how many years would it take them? This is all nonsense. So I don't. One of the things that does have to happen, and I don't think we can do it, is to get some people to sit down with whoever Iranians you have to and teach them strategy 1, 2, the basic lessons of nuclear policy and deterrence. I grew up as a nuclear strategist, and I could sit down, Jim Dobbins, there are other people in the room, sit down if we had the opportunity with senior Iranians and say, have you really thought about the following kinds of things? Here's a little Herman Kahn to read, or a Bernard Brody or something. Is this really what you want to do? And the wise ones would say, it's not such a bright idea anyway. It's a white elephant. White elephant. Okay, the idea of Iran with a nuclear weapon becoming a hegemon in the Persian Gulf. Give me a break. Iran is not a great power, and it's not going to become a great power. It might be the major power in the Middle East, might be a major power in the Middle East. It's not going to be a hegemon unless we are so chucklehead as to depart from the Middle East altogether. Now, a lot of Americans would like to get there and do that, and in fact, the same person the other day, unnamed person in a background interview, said, the tilt to Asia has something to do with being tired of wars in the Middle East and kind of wanting to depreciate what we're doing in the Middle East. I'll let you in on something. We can't leave the Middle East. We're a European power. We're also a Middle East power. We're going to be there. And the Libya thing just underscored. We're going to be there. We have no choice. Frankly, neither do our European allies, but they haven't woken up to that yet, and they kind of like to ignore it. And against that, what's Iran? We have a lot of people who mew and cry about it, and we can sell them a lot of weapons, which are going to be basically useless. They can look to us as security. If I were really worried about Iran in the Persian Gulf, I would worry about Iranian businessmen, Iranian culture, other things. I wouldn't worry about Iranian bombs or that sort of thing. I wouldn't worry about closing the Strait of Hormuz, through which Iran has to. This has just, I think, been grossly inflated. Remember, we are an extraordinarily powerful country. Next layer of analysis, we have to look at this region-wide. Am I allowed to say this? We and the Iranians do have some compatible interests. I've already mentioned Afghanistan. I think if we want to get out, having Iran involved in there, along with the others who are going to be involved, China, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, which is going to buy as much of Afghanistan as it possibly can, there are parts of Afghanistan where Iran has certain things that are compatible. The Russians are allowing us to use their territory and contiguous territory to supply folks in Afghanistan, our folks there. And incidentally, the Pakistanis, in order to get invited to Chicago, lifted the barrier on the flow of stuff this morning. That was a pretty good deal. But the Russians are allowing to do this in part because they suffer, number one, in the world from the supply of drugs from Afghanistan, and Iran is number 2. When I was in Afghanistan a few years ago, I was told that the Iranians had gone to NATO and said, look, do you mind, pretty please, putting some of your troops on our frontier and a provincial reconstruction team on our frontier? Because we're losing all these people to drug dealers. Most of the NATO countries said yes. The United States said no. Well, there you go, lost opportunity. And also with regard to Iraq, I think the Iranians might like to dominate Iraq. At the same time, I wonder whether the Iranians really would like to see an Iraq which could still go into civil war, etc. Now, these are minor things. Now, wait a second. There are certain more important things. Confidence-building measures. One thing I'd like to see us do. 1972, the height of the Cold War, the U.S. Navy and the Soviet Navy came to an epiphany. What happens if one of our ships run into the other guy's ship? And so we concluded at that time in the Cold War an incidents at sea agreement. Well, I think we should have an incidents at sea agreement with the Iranians. I think we should have a freedom of shipping agreement through the Strait of Hormuz. We already see Iranians cooperating on a tacit basis in counter-piracy. Well, maybe you don't want to keep it on tacit, maybe you want to make it explicit. These are things where we have common interests. Ping-pong diplomacy, whatever it is, these are things that could be done. One final thing I have to say about what we ought to be doing. I'd like to see I think if we were really serious about the negotiations, we just lift the sanctions. You want to influence the Iranian public? Get rid of the sanctions. Sanctions do not work. Well, I don't know whether to pause for that, but I can't think in all my 50 years in this business, maybe Jim will know someplace, I don't know a single time where sanctions have ever worked. In circumstances where countries see that they have some fundamental interest at heart. Sanctions did not bring down the South African regime. I don't know, but sanctions are a feel-good thing. They're a thing you do where you have to do something for public opinion. You want to show you're doing something, you want to show the Congress you're doing something, and you don't want to go to war. That's why you do sanctions. But if I were somebody in Iran right now and I wanted to have a poisonous relationship with us, I'd be up here working to get more sanctions. And one of the things, if I were the Ayatollah, I'd say, please, please, take the MEK off the terrorism list. If there's anybody who's hated in Iran more than the MEK, I'd like to know who it is. Perhaps somebody can enlighten me on that. That, I think, would be stupid from our part, in addition to immoral. I don't like taking people off a terrorism list that used to kill Americans, but then I'm a patriotic American. But if I really wanted to poison relationships, that's something I'd do. The other thing is, back in the Bush administration, when we were dealing with North Korea, senior leadership, once Condi Rice and once Mr. Richard Armitage said in public, we will not attack North Korea. We won't say that with regard to Iran. We will not say it. I've argued for years, let's make a list. What do we want from Iran? Make the whole list. And say, okay, if you do the whole list, we'll say we won't attack you, we'll give you guarantees, we'll work out, see, but we won't do it. Well, how are you possibly going to disarm your critics if you won't do this? I said not too long ago to somebody who has to remain nameless, but he was a person who represented his government at the talks in Baghdad. And I raised this with him. He said, well, if the Europeans say that security stuff doesn't count. I said, what if the United States were to say it? Oh, he said, that's a game changer. Issue over with. This is one of the negotiators. I can't name the country. It was off the record. You might be able to figure it out. But I think it's, the Europeans, one reason they've been involved in the P5+1, the overriding objective, they tell me, is to keep us from going to war with Iran. Okay, they don't want to get the bomb. Of course they don't want to get the bomb. I don't want them to get the bomb. But by gosh, if you don't want them to do that, you got to start thinking about basic strategic analysis and our interests overall. Now, what do the Iranians have to do? Lots of things. For one thing, which I don't think will happen, is to shut up. Every time Ahmadinejad says, was there a Holocaust? I'm not quite so sure. Every time he gets in trouble, he says that. Or maybe Israel shouldn't exist. He doesn't actually say that. What he says is, why don't we go back to 1947 and start over? Well, if I were an Israeli, I would see that as the same thing. And then we leap out of the water like a largemouth bass, and we snap at it. Okay, well, they got to shut up. Another thing I'd like to see, which I learned from Professor Hunter, if the Iranians really want to change things, they would reconnect with Israel. I remember a time of very profound Israeli-Iranian relations. Oh, I'm sorry, not just under the Shah, at the time of Iran-Contra. A relationship with Iran that was initiated by officials of the Israeli government. That seemed like a good idea at the time. It's about strategic calculation. Why are we only the ones that don't seem to be able to do that? Oh, incidentally, one other thing we need to do, and this will get me in trouble, we need to seize control of the issue back for the United States again. Seize it back again, so we decide these things on the basis of our strategic interests, not in terms of domestic politics. Incidentally, the most important date this year, in terms of preventing war, etc., and maybe having a chance to move forward in the future, was not in Baghdad a few weeks ago. It's not going to be May 23rd. It was March the 5th. when President Obama met with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and along with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and others, allowed Mr. Netanyahu to understand that a war with Iran was unacceptable, certainly until the 7th of November. Unfortunately, he had to sell that at a high price, which was keeping all options on the table. That's dumb. You don't say that. All options are always on the table. I mean, that's a kind of dumb bluff. Example, in 1998, when Milosevic was doing terrible things with regard to Kosovo, our negotiator, who remained nameless, blessed memory, convinced the NATO allies to fly the entire NATO air armada to the Serbian frontier and then turn back and come home. I said that was worse than doing nothing. That said bluff. All right, all options on the table. If you don't, then do it. Never pull out the gun unless you're going to shoot. And as soon as you say, you should never say that. I mean, let people understand it. We're a great power. We can calculate our interests. People can try to calculate our particular interests. Well, the way the president sold that, unfortunately, was to take off the table the idea of containment. Containment. It is unacceptable. Now, if we are now hostage in terms of American declaratory policy, either to break our word on that or to go to war with Iran, we are hostage to the Iranians not getting a nuclear weapon. A great power should never allow itself to become hostage in that way. Well, the president had to get past the election, so there you are. Final word. Talk. I don't know of any other country in the world that refuses to talk with everybody. The Israelis talk to the Iranians, off in the corner here. As I said, maybe we see some Iranians in conferences, that sort of thing. Back in the, before the Egypt thing, when I used to go to all kinds of conferences, there'd be an Israeli there, an Egyptian there. The first thing they'd go in the corner. The Egyptian military and the Israeli military, therefore, when it came to Camp David, implementing it was a piece of cake because they worked it all out years before. Well, this is what we have to talk with the Iranians. We have to get over this thing that somehow talking to somebody confers legitimacy. We're the only country in the world that does that. Now, nothing, hope to God, inshallah, will happen of an untoward nature until after our election. And then whoever's president, and whoever's president's going to face the same agenda, I hope they'll have the smarts to do the analysis, hire the people, and change the perspective so we can get the Iranian situation cut back down to the size it really deserves, which is not the size that we have given it. And then in the fullness of time, the fact that the United States is more popular with the Iranian people than is true in any other Middle East society may come to fruition. Thank you.